welcome to Future Assessment Episode 5. This is our midpoint for the series, actually, and backed by popular demand, I'm joined by David Gallagher. We had a really cool virtual coffee long before we did the Future of Assessment series, and I've had so many people say I'd like to get David back onto a live stream and onto the show. So, David, why don't you could join us into the studio and welcome.
Morning, Gavin. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. I'm really keen to have a chat around future assessment, but I'm really keen to get your take on it. And I think it's really interesting timing with what we've been saying about where we're at in this strange period of the pandemic. You know, it's still rumbling on, as we've both found. And it's just sort of where we're going from and to. But what I wanted to ask you first of all is something which has gone right at the top of the agenda for everyone, is with COP26 in Glasgow. What could the implicate with day two of COP26, and I don't think it's even probably started from yet, but what could the implications of COP26 have for the future of assessment, for the future of FE skills and employability?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a huge question, Gavin, and so many different threads to pull at there, because, I mean, education, of course, is key to, outcomes for the economy and for society. So education is profoundly important that we get education most broadly right to improve, the environment, to improve our situation in regards to climate and biodiversity and so many things. But, incredibly, as you know, when we first started thinking about future of assessment at NCFE about 2 years ago, incredibly, the first analogy that I gave, which many people now know that I live my life in analogies, was around the driving test. And how, if we thought about the driving test differently, which obviously it's an analogy that most people can identify with if they've learned to drive and hopefully passed the test. If we thought about shifting the driving test from a very transactional, you either passed or you failed, you can drive or you can't, to think about a broader set of outcomes, which actually could improve somebody's environmental impact. I didn't know till I would say probably my early 30s that my driving style actually affected carbon emissions. Just didn't have a clue. It wasn't in the discourse. It wasn't in any form of education. It certainly wasn't part of my learning to drive and my driving test earlier. But when I found out that actually pulling away fast at those lights just harms the environment, it made me really stop and think. Actually, sitting with my engine running, many people have got the automatic start stop now, but many people sit with the engine running. It's bad for the environment. So if we bake into the education of learning to drive as an example, but then we assess not just for can you drive safely, but actually does your driving style unnecessarily impact on the environment negatively? Could we and should we assess that differently? And even if that's just to give people advice rather than link to a pass or a fail. So, I mean, sometimes it's a really useful analogy to think about, because it's really obvious that we all know that cars and carbon emissions from cars impact negatively. But how many of us know that our driving style could make that less worse or worse? Do you know? And so it's those sorts of things that I think about. And where it hints at for me is in education and in assessment, it's about assessing for a broader set of outcomes. Are there opportunities to say, are you a good global citizen because of what you've learned, what you've put into practice, what you're doing through education, what you're doing more broadly? Are there opportunities for, projects which go and rewild the garden of a care home? So it encourages, more wildlife, more bees, for example, which we know are in decline. There's all sorts of these opportunities to not just green the curriculum, but look for broader sets of outcomes through assessment that represent, all sorts of different facets of how we can positively contribute to society and our communities and the environment. A really healthy environment, of course, is there anything more crucial than that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's really interesting if you're thinking around health and social care, the impacts of well-being. It's really well documented around sort of bringing people into nature and stuff like that. And I think that could be really interesting if you're like wilding out a garden or an area. Also save a bit of money as well. But through to like managerial, advising your staff and sort of stuff around sort of impact of what you're doing on the environment. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, actually. That's really cool. I think everyone needs to be taking a bit of advice from David on that one. I think that'd be brilliant to bring that in. Get up the COP26, David. I think you need to tell them. I think but honestly, I think that's a brilliant sort of thought process around how we from the driving test. You're right, you can either pass or fail, and there's so much more we could be doing. There's so much more we could potentially be doing with assessment, really, isn't there? Around educating from
Absolutely.
young all the way through as to how we could do impact and how we can make a difference to people. Really, that's really cool. My plan for today was to go through, because we're episode 5 and we've gone through some really cool episodes so far, is to maybe sort of unpack those a little bit more with you as to some of those episode sort of outcomes. One of the really cool ones, and it naturally leads from the driving test, is access and inclusivity, because that was with a really cool guest called Jem, and she has got physical barriers to coming involved with education. She gave a really cool analogy, because it was really powerful, actually. She was sitting there in her wheelchair telling us this, and it was really, really knocked me actually around disability, and like how for her she had to re-answer a question in her driving test around, well, what do you see if you see a disabled parking bay? Do you go and park in it? Do you park elsewhere? And she knew she should park in it, but the driving test couldn't tell that she had a physical barrier. And I thought it was really, 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 really powerful as to ways we need to be thinking around access and inclusivity. And it's just really interesting you said about the driving, because my first one I was going to ask about was access and inclusivity. But what can we learn around access and inclusivity around the future of assessment? Because that was really profound to me, and I could see how that could really be upsetting for Jem, which obviously was when she did it. But how can we be mindful of that for things in the future around access and inclusivity around the future of assessment?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most important keys to that is making sure that in the design process of not just assessments, but qualifications, programs more broadly, and then of course assessments as well, is that we are engaging and involving people who have lived experience that represents all of the different characteristics that we have in our communities and that we have in our society. Because if we don't do that, we will, inadvertently sometimes, unconsciously sometimes, put
Yeah,
these things in it that are just not inclusive and are not fair. It's not fair. That example, it's not fair. Somebody, in my view, shouldn't have to experience that to identify that
yeah,
it's wrong. We should prevent it rather than fix it once it's happened. And it's a huge challenge, because whether we like to admit it or not, we all carry unconscious bias around with us. And even sometimes when you think you've taken it out of the process, somebody may have a very different lived experience to you that highlights that actually something is genuinely just not inclusive, or it's not fair, or it's not considerate. And so I think it's just really important. And of course, we look at this from the perspective of primarily an assessment and an awarding organisation, but it's about bringing a diverse range of lived experiences relevant to that particular topic right to the beginning of a design process, to really consider whether consciously or unconsciously there are things creeping into the design of qualifications, the design of assessments that penalise people, that put people at a disadvantage, that treat them unfairly. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And of course, it's really hard to do because we're very diverse as people. It's such a rich mix of diversity in many of our communities and in society more broadly. It's a real challenge to do. But if we're serious about inclusivity, and I think we have to be, then that is something that we really need to bring to the forefront, not just hope that it gets captured at the delivery stage. So it's whether that's about ethnic minority backgrounds, whether it's about disability, whether it's about protected characteristics more broadly, or even broader than that. There are so many things that we need to consider, and it's important that we do that well. Because everybody, I mean, we've got this, Gavin, at NCFE, we've got a really deep belief that everyone has got unlimited potential.
yeah,
Everyone's potential is different, but they've got potential to do well through education, to do well through work, to do well in life, however you define that. So, and even then it links back to this point around broader outcomes. Should it all be about a pass or a fail? Should it all be about you've got that qualification or not? Should we all aspire to get that particular job, or should we aspire to be good human beings? And how do
yeah,
you measure that? How do you
yeah,
measure
yeah.
that? So they're the sorts of really profound things that we and many others in the sector are really thinking about. How do you get it right by design? How do you look at a broader set of outcomes that are more important to society than just a qualification? And I know qualifications are hugely important. Of course, I think they're massively important, but there's more to life than just that.
Yeah, 100%. I know we talked about this before, but around the pandemic and how that's changed people's access, in person and also digitally. We're moving into this sort of hybrid, quite cool. It's a bit like with the car thing again. We're moving this cool hybrid sort of world. We're not fully electric yet, are we? Do you know what I mean? Or fully hydro, whatever it's going to be. And it's this sort of, how do you sort of see the future of assessment sort of moving around this sort of blended approach, where people are always on? They can, on the phone, on their laptop, on their TV, they can be on the train, when they're traveling to work, or, Netflixing and doing a bit of multitasking. What do you sort of see is the future around assessment around that? Because I think that's really, really exciting, because that sort of moves the boundary of it being a summer exam all the time. Do you know what I mean? People having this sort of mindset of a fixed sort of exam date. But what does that mean for you're the chief executive of an awarding organisation? Is that like a massive headache if all of the dates all change on assessments and stuff? Or is that then like, not, this is like a unique opportunity for me to sort of go, I want to be amazing, we can do this. But then to have the reality of what does it mean? Do you know what I mean? Is to actually deliver that.
Yeah, again, there's so much in there. So I just scribbled myself some notes there. So some of what I was thinking about. So I tell you what I'll do. I'll start with apprenticeships. And last summer is a perfect example. The Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, working with endpoint assessment organisations, working with employers, working with providers, in my view, did a fantastic job of adapting assessments to make sure we could keep apprenticeships moving. And that involved a lot more, employers getting a bit more hands-on in terms of things like observations and things like professional discussions that were then quality assured, but the employer was there in situ anyway. And, so there was an element of, we've got to trust the employer, but then we provided a different type of quality assurance. We allowed some things to be done remotely that previously we didn't feel that was possible, never mind preferable. And we managed to make that happen, at scale. Now, one of the things that people don't then talk about is how much did that reduce our carbon footprint? We weren't traveling, and in some instances now we look back and think, why the heck were we traveling anyway? Was that really necessary? So we reduced the carbon footprint. We raised the level of trust in the system because employers were more trusted, employers were more engaged in the process, and we still provided really good quality assurance, and we kept the system moving and got people out into the work, skilled, competent, productive. So there, some of the things that I think about on those threads. But then if I sort of take a step back from that as an example of, how I think things could shift, we've got to have a system of qualifications and assessment that is coherent. Incoherence is one of our problems at the moment. People don't necessarily know which path to take, what's right for them, what's not right for them, what's the value of this thing if I invest my time and possibly my money in it. So we need coherence. We need credibility, We've got to have integrity flowing through our education system more broadly, through qualifications and assessment. We have to have something that is trusted by society, it's trusted by learners, it's trusted by employers, it's trusted by us, but we've got to, assure that and make sure that the accountability is right. So coherence and credibility are key things. And then the last point, and I think this is probably the most important point, and then I'll come to some of the downsides, it's about currency. And what I mean by currency is not necessarily the regulatory version of currency. It's more about, is this thing worth something? So I've done it. How does this thing enable me to get to where my desired destination is, my goal is, my objective, the job, a better pay, a happier life, a healthier life? There's all sorts of these different outcomes. So we've got to have a system that has a what I describe as a globally recognized store of value. So, this is where me and you last time were off onto NFTs and on crypto and what have you. And it's got to have currency. And what that then means for assessment is that it's got to be valid, it's got to be reliable. We've got to be able to, as the public at large, trust that this thing is what it really says it is. And that's really hard to do in a massively flexible world. If you can just take an assessment anywhere, anytime, through any medium, that's really hard to maintain that credibility, that currency, and that coherence. And so I think that's sort of the circle that we've got to square, really. How do you have something that meets societal needs for convenience? Because we are in a convenient society, how do we do that? Or is that the right thing to do? Or do we stick rigidly to, no, it's summer and it's this and it's that? Where the whole world is going to on demand, anytime, anywhere, digitally enabled. Do we go there, or do we stay in the past and stick to what we've got, whilst making sure that we maintain the level of trust, because people come out of the other side with currency that is understood, it's trusted,
Yeah.
it's valued. So they're the sort of the big challenges. The one thing that I will say in it, and it maybe plays into the example that you gave as well, Gavin, one of our huge worries about more remote and hybrid and digitally enabled is whether that's through digital exclusion, digital poverty, lack of
Yeah.
connectivity, inability to use the system effectively, having to hunch over, your kids' bunk beds because you don't have an appropriate place to undertake an assessment. We've got to think really carefully about how we ensure that people are not further disadvantaged through this more efficient way of doing assessment, because undoubtedly a lot of it is more efficient, to do it through technology. But there are some examples that we came across where people are further disadvantaged, who were probably disadvantaged already in a number of ways, further disadvantaged by moving to this world. And that is absolutely, well, it's not acceptable. We cannot do that. We've got to make sure the system as a whole is fair, it's inclusive, it's reliable. And actually, we try and find ways to best support disadvantaged people, not make them further disadvantaged just because this thing is more efficient. It suits, a global trend towards on-demand, anytime, anywhere. So there's so many challenges in it. This in itself we could probably talk about all day, which I've nearly just done, actually.
No. I think that's really, really, really interesting. Like, I think you're absolutely right. It's getting that balance, isn't it? And the pandemic highlighted so many times we're both incredibly lucky that we've got space that we can work from home, and like you said, it isn't hunched over someone's bunk bed. There's lots of times I've been doing like different streams when people were like, well, people haven't been able to put on their cameras and stuff when we've been working with them. There's probably a reason why they haven't wanted to put on their cameras. Do you know what I mean? It's like their environment isn't sort of, they're just doing their very best in the situation that they've got, and everyone's been there. FE is a sector that has been there, but in personal sort of circumstances, it's very difficult if you've not got the space to be able to learn, isn't it? And I think that's really, really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of talk of, it could be on the bus on your phone, but if that's a necessity, that's your best learning space, then that isn't great, is it? Do you know what I mean? It's just, I think you've got a really, really incredibly interesting, important point, which I think a lot of people need to be sort of, like you're saying, squaring the circle really around sort of what does it mean to do that. I think there's different ways as well to do like hybrid approach to learning. I wouldn't mind chatting to you about as well, because I could chat about this forever. Is around, is there ways where we can make things a little bit more bespoke around what the learner needs? So we've got like a core qualification, an apprenticeship, a T level, or whatever, a boot camp. Is there ways then we could then add on stackable, like sort of micro credential skills within that? And what is that like as an awarding organisation? Because a lot of this is sort of really cool theorising, but as you've just sort of highlighted, if once you really start to think about it, then there's other things which you've got to take into account, and everyone that is sort of future assessment movement is we need to change what assessment is, but you've obviously put an awful lot of thought into it. But how would that sort of work with like your awarding, chief exec hat on around having qualifications and then doing micro credentials, which could be anytime, any place sort of additions, value, access? There's so much to bring on board there, isn't there? Do you know what I mean? It's
yeah. Well, I mean, the first thread I suppose I pull up on that one is I found it quite odd when I moved to this part of the sector. Many of you know that most of my career I've been provider side, working with independent providers, working with colleges, doing consultancy work, CPD type work in the sector and policy and funding work back in the day as well. So for quite a while now. So this was the first time I came to the awarding and the assessment part of the industry. And one of the things that I suppose I'd never really thought about particularly deeply before was we've got a very healthy obsession, I think, with personalizing teaching and learning, understanding the learner, understanding their needs, understanding how best to meet those needs through differentiated approaches to teaching and learning. And I still think we've got a long way to go on that in tertiary education in FE, but we take it really seriously, and I think that's a good thing. Yet when it comes to assessment, it's the complete opposite. We've got an obsession with standardization, test everybody exactly the same way, and I understand the reasons for that, and I understand the logic behind it, but it does jar with me in a sense that if people's potential is personal. If we want the best for everybody, is there a more nuanced approach to personalising assessment as well? Now that then becomes really difficult with the, what's the old adage, comparing apples with apples? How do you do that? But it's Ken Robinson said it best, didn't he, years ago when he did the voice over the RSA animate thing. We're obsessed with batching kids up, and it's not just kids, it's adults as well by date of manufacture, and then pushing them through the process and assessing them in this standardized way. Well, education isn't a production line, or at least I don't think it is, and I don't think it should be. So I think we should be looking at ways that we can personalize the experience, the whole experience, how we understand people before they even make a choice about a program, how we set them up for success at the start by helping them to understand themselves, their context, their objectives, their opportunities. If we do that better, I think we get a better start in learning at whatever stage in life. How do we personalize the whole experience? How do we, for some people, possibly break assessments down into micro formative type assessments that build up to something? I think I said to you before, Gavin, I was, I suppose, fortunate in a way that I could sit exams, not a problem at all. I could turn up with little prep and sit an exam. Coursework, I'm terrible. To this day, I'm terrible. But give me an exam any day, and that's just not fair. The old twin brother or twin sister thing. If they're wired slightly different, if their brain is optimized differently for just the paradigm that is now, is that fair? If just because one of us copes with pressure or stress differently or better. So I think we need to think about assessment as part of the experience. How we can think about, finding ways of comparing similar things so we understand, the currency of what that person has done. But we find better ways to make it fit where people get excited about doing assessments, because they'll learn about where they're at, they'll learn about themselves, they'll hopefully learn about what they could do next. They'll be recognised and celebrated for whatever their success is, not just how the world deems it. And I know that's quite controversial for an awarding organisation to say, and possibly for regulators who might be watching. But I just think we need to do better in terms of thinking about the whole experience as an opportunity to learn. And one of the things it really struck me when I was getting into future of assessment early on, that we talk about formative assessment and summative or synoptic assessment. And somebody described the definition between the two as formative is for learning and summative is about learning. And I said, well, why isn't summative for learning as well? What stops you from doing a summative or synoptic endpoint assessment, whether that's an exam, whether it's an EPA, whatever it might be, and learning about what you've learned and learning about where you are and learning about what comes next and being excited about that? Whenever we do bloody personality profiles, we're excited to see what the outcome is. When most of them set exams, we're horrified in case we failed. That's just, it's not right, is it? There's got to be a better way of engaging people and enthusing people, because every type of assessment should be an opportunity to learn. And so that, I could go on all day about that. So bolting things on, if people have better forms of assessment at different junctures, it could serve up then this is what you definitely need to do. These are the things that you could do. This is what other people like you did, which sounds very similar to some other technology in our lives, doesn't it? And I think that then it's not then just personalized assessment, it's a personalized journey, it's a personalized experience. And I think for me, that's what we need to aspire to.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then that could then open up, different avenues, and it's sort of bringing in careers advice and guidance a little bit, isn't it? It's bringing in automation around, if you did that with AI, that's really cool. And also it opens up barriers. So if someone's got a neurodiversity or something, you could then say, well, you may not have known, like I did something the other day with around prison ed, and it was like, I think it was 40% of inmates were permanently excluded from school. I thought that was a shocking fact. And it's just probably because they're quite an extreme way of, I know there's also a high amount of neurodiversity in inmates as well. That's a shocker that someone's had to sort of kick off that much to then get kicked out of school, and then they've got no other options. So how could education support them sort of ongoing so you can break that cycle? And it's sort of, that's really exciting. I think that's really, really interesting. We're nearly at the close, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the rebrand. Wasn't just a rebrand for you guys. I wanted to talk to you about this because I know it's bringing in lots of different parts of the NCFE family together to then look at what is the future of assessment. So what I wanted to sort of talk to you about was, how did that sort of go as a leader, of bringing the different parts of the family together, and it isn't just a rebrand. Do you know what I mean? It's just you sort of had a longer term sort of vision of what you wanted to do. And I just wanted to talk to you about that, because I think that it's another one of those unique opportunities where if I was to see your AOC in a couple of weeks, which I probably will, you wouldn't really be able to have this conversation. So I just was really keen to find out how it's going, and what the vision was, and what the future is that you're seeing around the future of assessment, and what the future for NCFE could be, really.
Yeah. So I suppose the vision in some ways is quite simple, actually, Gavin. It's as an educational charity, the most important person for us is our beneficiary. It's our beneficiaries, and they are prospective learners, the people who've completed learning. They are quite literally the most important people for us as an educational charity. And so what we thought about, I suppose, as a precursor to setting a vision is, how do we help learners to make the best possible choice about learning? How do we set them up for success? How do we help them have the best experience, which hopefully then, we get all of that right. It delivers the best outcomes and the best opportunities for progression. And that is then the centre of everything that we do. So then when, I suppose, we thought about, and there's lots of, complexity to some elements of the vision that I'll not go to, but we then looked at our business as it was, 2 years ago, and we had a diagnostic assessment business in what was Skills Forward, which is now NCFE Skills Assessments. We had lots of things happening as part of the on-programme journey, so qualifications, teaching and learning content, CPD for practitioners, partnerships with World Skills. There's a whole raft of things that we do that ultimately support institutions and educators to deliver the best experience. And then, of course, we had sort of the end of the journey as well, so exams, synoptic tests, endpoint assessments, etc. And when we looked at our business activities, we really just sort of said, well, they're not connected. And because they're not connected, are we putting all of our products and services together in a way that enables the institution, so colleges, schools, training providers, employers, universities to some extent as well, which then enables their educators to provide the best possible high quality experience end to end, initially start of program to end of program. But we're also then thinking about how do we reach pre-program to support the best decisions, and then what do we think about post-program to say, well, what was the impact and what next? Because we're all here for a lifetime of learning now, and we know investment in that is absolutely crucial. So as we were thinking that through in terms of our strategy, it just, I suppose, in some ways became obvious, scarily obvious in some ways, actually, because it's a big decision, but quite obvious that actually let's bring all of that together, one NCFE connected around the learner journey that is here to support institutions and educators to deliver the very best experience and outcomes they possibly can. And so that was, as I say, the reason it was scary is because rebranding a grand old institution of 173 years old with lots of other moving parts to it, that was a massive undertaking. And the team at NCFE have been absolutely phenomenal, whether it was NCFE, Cash, Skills Forward, other parts of the organisation. And really, the team that delivered that rebrand have done an exceptional job. We had some brilliant external support as well. So I take little to no credit for it, really. It was really the team that did all of that. But it was just around that very simple guiding idea that we want to support learners to make the best choices, have the best experiences, and have the best possible outcomes that delivers the maximum value to them over a lifetime of learning. And it was just that simple, really.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's about 6 weeks probably now into it, so it's still early days, isn't it? But it's just like that's really, because I think it's interesting for a number of reasons, because it was a brave move to do. Do you know what I mean? It must have been like a proper headache. But if you think of it sort of bigger sort of ecosystem sort of approach, us as a sector needs to be thinking a bit more like that as well, around how do we do this as a joined up approach for the whole learner journey, for the employer, so for the institution, college, provider, school, university. How do we make it easy to be able to engage, all sort of learner journey long, isn't it, for us to be able to work with everyone? I think it's this interesting but also brave move to do for the sector to be sort of looking at this as an analogy. We're doing analogies everywhere. Analogy again, do you know what I mean? I just think it's interesting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I definitely. I mean, in some ways, again, I think it can be simple, and I think we overcomplicate it. The vast majority of people I meet in this system are here for the same purpose, best for learners and for the best outcomes for learners. So if we just always remember that, if we get better at collaborating, if we get better at sharing, if we get better at recognizing where we're not best placed as an organisation to do something, and actually somebody is better than us, And I know that's quite, I suppose, ideological in a way, and it's harder to deliver on that. And we're by no stretch of the imagination are we perfect on that. It's something that we'll continuously strive for. If we can go back to that sort of those simple ways of looking at it, I think it can be really powerful and can compel you to look at things a bit differently. I mean, one of the ways in which we're trying to bring, I suppose, greater coherence to the system is looking to partner where other organisations, do things. We've got a complementary, I suppose, culture and values and what have you, but actually we've got different skill sets or different expertise. How can we put that together in new and interesting ways to deliver more value ultimately for the learner? And that might be efficiency, it might be effectiveness, it might be innovation, it might be saying, well, we've just got something that if you use that, you'd be able to do a better job, or if you partnered with us, that'd help us to do a better job. So for me, right at the centre of all of it is collaborating around shared purpose. And I think the vast majority of us in this sector have got that shared purpose. It's why we're here in the first place, and it's why we stay and why we love it.
Yeah, no, definitely, 100%. At times, completely gone. I could talk to you forever, David. I'm going to ask one last thing, because I'd be interested to know what you're going to say on it, actually. Is if you could dream and dream big, what would you want to see for the future of assessment?
Ooh, wow, that's a big question. So what I would want to see is learners who, across the board, whether that's young people, whether that's adults, whether that's people looking to retrain, whether that's people making the first career choice or the 10th career choice, that they feel well informed, well equipped, and in control of the decisions they take, and know what is right for them. And I know that's possibly a long way out. But if we can enable learners to make fantastic choices and have the best experiences, an assessment, whether that's diagnostic assessment, pre-program, start of program, formative assessment, ongoing diagnostic assessment, it all needs to come together in a way that informs learners and helps them to make those great choices and have the best experiences.
Yeah, no, that's really, really cool. David, thank you so much for your time today. Audience, thank you for joining us. I hope you really enjoyed, be able to just grab a coffee and some time with David talking about the future of assessment. This is total collaboration between NCFE and FE News. So some big thank yous to Lindsay and Kim in the background that have made the magic happen. FE News and Leah, thanks for making the magic happen. Kelly and Finley as well. And see you same time next week, 9:30 Tuesdays for episode 6 of Future of Assessment. We'll see you really soon.